Hey guys, tonight we are stepping back into the long, winding shadows of history to explore some of the most mind-bendingly strange and frankly terrifying punishments ever devised by human minds. Imagine finding yourself on the wrong side of the law in ancient Rome, or perhaps ancient Babylon, or even medieval England. Your fate? Well, let's just say it wasn't going to be a quiet chat and a stern telling off. You might be facing something truly bizarre, something that makes modern penalties look like a gentle pat on the head. Think about it. You could be tossed off a cliff, sewn into a sack with angry animals, or perhaps slowly, very slowly, dismantled in public. It's a stark reminder that while justice systems have evolved, their origins were often rooted in fear, spectacle, and a level of creativity in inflicting pain that's hard to fathom today. You probably won't survive this historical journey in comfort, but hopefully, you'll learn something fascinating. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling up to it, drop your location and local time in the comments below. It's always cool to see where everyone is listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our first stop on this slightly unsettling tour takes us back to the heart of the Roman Empire, a civilization famed for its laws, its legions, and apparently, its truly unique ways of dealing with certain specific crimes. Imagine, if you can, being accused of the most heinous crime imaginable in Roman society: parricide. That's the killing of your own father, or sometimes, by extension, other close family members like your mother, siblings, or even a patron. This wasn't just murder. It was an attack on the very foundation of Roman life, the family unit, the paterfamilias, the absolute authority of the father. The Romans had a name for the punishment reserved for this specific, abhorrent act, the pena culei, or the punishment of the sack. And let me tell you, it was a doozy. Picture this scene unfolding down by the Tiber River, or maybe in a public square. You, the condemned, stand there, perhaps still reeling from the accusation, the trial, if you even got one that was fair, and the inevitable guilty verdict. The crowd murmurs, a mix of horror and morbid fascination. The executioners approach, but they don't carry axes or ropes. Instead, they bring animals. Specifically, a dog, a rooster, a monkey, and a snake. Yes, you heard that right. A menagerie worthy of a very strange circus act, except this is no performance for entertainment, it's your final, terrifying moments. The core of the punishment involves a large leather sack. This sack isn't just any old bag, it's often described as an ox hide, a tough, durable material. Your hands are bound behind your back, and your feet are tied together. Then, the animals are forced into the sack with you. The dog, perhaps snapping and barking, confused and scared. The rooster, likely squawking and flapping wildly in the confined space. The monkey, probably chattering nervously, its small hands potentially scratching and grabbing anything it can. And the snake, well, a snake in a sack with panicked creatures and a terrified human is never a good sign. Once you and your unwilling companions are inside, the sack is tightly sewn shut. Imagine the sheer terror of being trapped in darkness, the frantic movements of the animals, the sharp claws and beaks, the chilling slither of the snake, all compounded by the knowledge of what comes next. It's a symphony of panic and claustrophobia. The sack, now containing you and the struggling animals, is then carried to the water. This is where historians still argue whether the preferred method was simply throwing the sack into the Tiber River, or if it was sometimes dropped from a bridge or even carried out to sea. Regardless of the exact entry point, the end result is the same: you are drowned. But it's not a quick drowning. Trapped in the sack with living, struggling creatures, you're battered and scratched as the water rushes in. The animals, fighting for air themselves, might turn on you in their desperation. The experience would be a horrific, chaotic struggle for survival in the dark, rapidly filling space, until finally, the water claims you and your bizarre, ill-fated companions. Why these specific animals? That's another point of scholarly debate. Some historians believe each animal symbolized a different aspect of the crime, or its violation of the natural order. The dog, perhaps representing the unnaturalness of the act, turning on its master like a dog turning on its owner. The rooster, a creature associated with dawn and new beginnings, here trapped in darkness. The monkey, often seen as a distorted reflection of humanity, representing the twisted nature of the crime. And the snake, of course, a creature often associated with deceit, poison, and evil. Others argue the choice was more practical, readily available animals that would add to the terror and chaos within the sack. Maybe they just drew names out of a hat that day. Right, today's parricide gets Dave the rooster, Bartholomew the monkey, Sparky the dog, and oh look, a little garden snake. Probably not, but it adds a certain morbid humor to the thought. The Pina Culei wasn't a punishment for just any murder. It was specifically for parricide, highlighting the extreme horror with which Romans viewed this particular crime. It wasn't a common occurrence, thankfully, but the fact that such a specific, elaborate, and utterly bizarre punishment existed speaks volumes about Roman values and their capacity for creative retribution. It evolved over time, too. Earlier forms might have involved just the sack and the drowning, with the animals added later, perhaps during the imperial period, to increase the horror and symbolism. It was even revived centuries later by Emperor Justinian, showing its lasting, albeit gruesome, legacy. Imagine bringing that back. You know that old sack thing with the animals? Let's do that again. The public nature of the execution was also key. It wasn't just about punishing the individual. It was a terrifying spectacle meant to deter anyone else from even contemplating such a crime. You didn't just disappear. Your final moments were a public display of the state's absolute condemnation of your actions, a visceral warning to the masses. It was history's most disturbing pet carrier service, delivered with extreme prejudice. So, as you drift deeper into this historical journey, picture that scene by the river, the crowd, the sack, the frantic sounds from within, and the final, silent plunge into the water. A truly bizarre end, reserved for the most unnatural of crimes in the eyes of ancient Rome. A punishment that combined claustrophobia, animal terror, and drowning into one uniquely awful package. It's a far cry from community service, isn't it? From the unique horror of the Pina Culei, we transition to a punishment that, while perhaps slightly less bizarre in its concept, was infinitely more common and equally terrifying, facing wild animals in the Roman arena. Yes, the same Colosseum you might picture filled with gladiators was also a stage for executions, and sometimes you were the main course. This wasn't about skill or combat prowess. This was about spectacle, fear, and a brutal demonstration of power. You might find yourself condemned ad bestias. To the beasts. Imagine yourself standing there, the roar of the crowd echoing off the stone tiers, the smell of dust, sweat, and something distinctly animalistic thick in the air. The bright Roman sun beats down, reflecting off the golden sand of the arena floor. You're not wearing armor, probably not even a tunic. You might be naked, tied to a stake, or perhaps just pushed out into the vast, open space with nowhere to run. The gates on the far side, the Porta Libidinensis, Gate of Death, loom ominously. The purpose here wasn't a fair fight. This wasn't a gladiator combat where a skilled fighter might earn their freedom or glory. This was a public execution designed to be swift, brutal, and visually impactful. The victims were often criminals, prisoners of war, or, notoriously, early Christians who refused to renounce their faith. For the Romans, it was entertainment, a way to reinforce social order, and a stark warning. For you, it was the end. Suddenly, a heavy gate grinds open somewhere beneath the stands. A low growl, then a mighty roar erupts, silencing the crowd for a breathless moment before they erupt again in anticipation. And then it emerges. A lion, perhaps, or a tiger, or a bear, blinking in the sudden light, its eyes scanning the arena floor. It sees you. And you see it. There's no mistaking the predatory focus in its gaze. The types of animals used were varied and often exotic, a testament to the vast reach of the Roman Empire. Lions from Africa, tigers from Asia Minor, bears from Europe, wild bulls, sometimes even leopards or hyenas. Sourcing these animals was a massive logistical undertaking, requiring complex networks of hunters, traders, and transporters to bring them from distant lands to arenas across the empire. Think about the ancient equivalent of trying to ship a dozen angry lions from Sudan to Rome. Probably more complicated than ordering something online today, and definitely smellier. Your fate is sealed. The animal, or often multiple animals, are released. They are hungry, perhaps even goaded or intentionally agitated before being let into the arena. You have no training, no weapons to speak of, maybe just a flimsy piece of cloth for cover. Your only options are futile attempts to dodge, to scream, or to simply stand and face the inevitable. The crowd watches, cheering or jeering, placing bets on how quickly you'll fall. It's a horrifying, one-sided struggle that lasts only moments. Historians still argue whether the animals were deliberately starved beforehand to make them more aggressive, or if simply being in the strange, loud environment was enough to trigger their predatory instincts. Some accounts suggest animals were sometimes trained to attack humans on command, but the extent and effectiveness of such training is debated. It's likely a mix, a naturally dangerous animal, transported under stressful conditions, and then released into a chaotic arena with a vulnerable target probably didn't need much extra motivation. This punishment, damnatio ad bestias, became a staple of Roman public spectacles, particularly during the imperial period. It wasn't just about death, it was about humiliating death. Criminals were often stripped naked to strip them of their dignity. Christians were sometimes dressed in animal skins, mocked as beasts themselves before being thrown to real ones. It was a deliberate act of dehumanization before the final, brutal end. Think about the sheer terror of those final seconds. The thundering paws on the sand, the hot breath, the gnashing teeth. There was no escape, no mercy. Just the raw, primal violence of nature unleashed, amplified by the bloodthirsty roar of thousands of spectators. It makes the sack punishment, as bizarre as it was, almost feel contained. At least there you were in the dark, with a limited number of companions. Here, you were exposed, vulnerable, the star of a morbid show. There are accounts, often legendary, of some individuals surviving these encounters, perhaps by sheer luck, or the animal being surprisingly docile, or even intervention from the crowd or emperor. But these were exceedingly rare exceptions. For the vast majority condemned ad bestias, their final moments were spent in the jaws and claws of wild animals, for the entertainment of the Roman public. It's a chilling reminder of how cheap life could be, and how creative societies could get in finding ways to end it publicly and spectacularly. Imagine going to the zoo, but instead of looking at the animals, you're thrown to them. Yeah, not a fun day out. This form of punishment wasn't unique to Rome in concept. Other cultures used wild animals in warfare or execution, but the Romans elevated it to a form of mass public entertainment on an unprecedented scale. It was a cornerstone of the games, right alongside chariot races and gladiator duels, offering a different kind of thrill, the thrill of watching human life extinguished by untamed, brutal force. A truly wild way to go, wouldn't you say? Leaving the terrifying spectacle of the Roman arena and the hungry jaws of the bestia, we move to another method of Roman execution, one that might be less instantly bizarre than being sewn into a sack with a snake, but was arguably far more common, more widespread, and involved a prolonged, agonizing public display of suffering. I'm talking about crucifixion. While the Romans didn't invent it, the practice existed in various forms in other cultures like the Persians. They certainly perfected its use as a tool of terror and control across their vast empire. This wasn't a quick death, it was a slow, public spectacle designed to break the spirit of the condemned and serve as a horrific warning to anyone who dared defy Roman authority. Imagine yourself standing there, having been condemned for rebellion, piracy, serious theft, or perhaps simply being a non-Roman who seriously annoyed the wrong official. The journey to the execution site, often outside the city walls along a major road, would have been a public humiliation in itself. You might have been scourged beforehand, your back a mess of pain and blood, and perhaps forced to carry the heavy wooden crossbeam, the patibulum, to the place where you would meet your end. The crowd gathers, a mix of morbid onlookers, soldiers, and perhaps even family or friends watching in despair. The cross itself wasn't always the iconic shape we often picture. It could be a simple stake, asterisk crux simplex asterisk, a T-shape, asterisk crux commissa asterisk, or the more familiar cross shape, asterisk crux submissa asterisk. Regardless of the exact form, the purpose was the same: to elevate your suffering for maximum public visibility. The upright stake would likely already be in place at the execution ground, a grim forest of death lining the road. Now comes the awful part. Your arms are stretched out along the crossbeam. This is where one of those open scholarly debates comes in. Were you nailed through the palms or the wrists? While popular imagery often shows nails through the hands, many historians and medical experts argue that nails through the palms wouldn't support the weight of a human body and would likely tear through the flesh. Nailing through the wrists, specifically through the carpals, would provide a more secure, albeit still horrific, hold, possibly damaging the median nerve and causing excruciating pain that would shoot up your arms. Alternatively, ropes might have been used instead of nails, especially if wood was scarce or the executioners were feeling slightly less metal that day, though slightly less metal, in this context, is still pretty hardcore. Let's assume, for the sake of maximum historical discomfort, you get the nails. Once your hands, or wrists, are secured to the crossbeam, the beam is then lifted and attached to the upright post, often by ropes or sometimes slotted into place. This jarring movement would send a fresh wave of agony through your injured limbs. Your feet are then secured to the upright post. Again, nails or ropes could be used. If nails were used, they might be driven through the feet, perhaps stacked one foot over the other, or side by side. A small wooden block or peg might be added as a footrest, asterisk subpedaneum asterisk, or a seat, asterisk sedile asterisk. Now you might think, oh, a footrest, how nice. But these weren't for comfort. They were often added to prolong the suffering, allowing the condemned to push up slightly to breathe, delaying the inevitable asphyxiation. Cruel, right? It's like offering you a tiny ladder to nowhere. So there you hang. Exposed to the elements, the scorching sun or chilling wind, depending on the season. Your body weight pulls down on your arms and shoulders, stretching your ligaments and joints, causing intense pain and cramping. Breathing becomes incredibly difficult. To inhale, you have to push up with your legs, if you have a footrest, or pull up with your arms, both movements causing searing pain at the points of attachment. Exhaling is slightly easier, but the effort required to inhale becomes increasingly exhausting. Death on the cross wasn't typically from blood loss, though that certainly contributed, especially if you were scourged heavily first. The primary cause was usually asphyxiation or exhaustion leading to cardiac arrest. As your strength failed, you could no longer push or pull yourself up to fully inflate your lungs. Your diaphragm would struggle, you'd gasp for air, and carbon dioxide would build up in your blood. It was a slow, suffocating process, sometimes taking hours, sometimes even days, depending on the physical condition of the condemned, the method of attachment, and the environmental conditions. The public nature was crucial. You weren't just dying, you were dying in front of everyone. People would pass by on the road, soldiers would stand guard, the crowd would watch. They might mock you, throw things, or simply stare. There was no privacy, no dignity. Your suffering was a public spectacle, a living billboard advertising the consequences of challenging Rome. Imagine trying to take a nap in that situation. Impossible. A mainstream historical fact about crucifixion is that it was a common punishment for slaves, pirates, and rebels throughout the Roman Empire. It was considered a particularly humiliating death, reserved largely for those without Roman citizenship. For a Roman citizen, even a serious crime might result in a different, less dishonorable execution, like beheading. Crucifixion was the ultimate expression of Roman contempt for the condemned. It wasn't just about ending a life. It was about utterly destroying the person's status and dignity, both in this life and potentially in the afterlife according to some beliefs. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to crucifixion is the practice called crurifragium, or leg breaking. Sometimes, to hasten death, or sometimes just for extra cruelty, the executioners would break the legs of the crucified victim with a heavy club or iron bar. With broken legs, the condemned could no longer push up to breathe, and death by asphyxiation would occur much more quickly. This was often done at the end of the day if the Romans wanted to clear the crosses before nightfall. It's a grim detail, but it highlights the Roman capacity for efficiency even in their barbarity. Right, lads, knock off time in an hour, better crack on with the leg breaking. The psychological torment must have been immense. The pain, the thirst, the exposure, the public humiliation, the slow realization that there was no escape, no hope. You were utterly at the mercy of the elements, and your own failing body. Soldiers might gamble for your clothes at the foot of the cross, adding yet another layer of indignity. It was designed to be a complete erasure of the individual, leaving only the suffering body as a warning. While we often associate crucifixion with a single, famous historical figure, it's important to remember that thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, of people were crucified by the Romans over the centuries. It was a standard, brutal tool in their arsenal of control, used extensively in provinces prone to rebellion, like Judea. The roads leading into major cities could be lined with crosses after a revolt, a silent, horrifying testament to Roman power. So, as you hang there, the sun beating down, the pain radiating through your body, struggling for every breath, remember that this slow, public agony was a deliberate, calculated punishment by one of history's most powerful empires. It wasn't just death. It was a drawn-out, agonizing process designed to inflict maximum physical and psychological suffering, turning the condemned into a living, dying example for the masses. A truly terrible way to spend your final hours, wouldn't you agree? Leaving the agony of the cross behind, we shift our focus from individual crimes against society, or the family, to failures within the very engine of Roman power, the legions. Discipline was paramount in the Roman military. It was what forged raw recruits into the most formidable fighting force of the ancient world. But what happened when that discipline broke down? When a unit faltered in battle, showed cowardice, or even mutinied? The Romans had a terrifying answer, a punishment so severe and so random it would shatter the bonds of brotherhood forged in battle and replace them with terror. This was decimatio, or decimation. Imagine yourself a Roman soldier, perhaps part of a cohort, or even an entire legion that has recently suffered a humiliating defeat. Maybe you fled in the face of the enemy, perhaps your unit refused an order, or worse, openly defied your commanders. Now you stand shoulder to shoulder with your comrades, not on a battlefield, but in a grim assembly ground within the camp. The air is thick with tension, fear replacing the usual soldierly bravado. You know something terrible is about to happen, something collective. The senior officers, the tribunes or the legate himself, address the disgraced unit. Their words are harsh, condemning your actions not just as a failure, but as a betrayal of Rome, of your fellow soldiers who stood firm, and of the very gods who watched over the legions. The sentence is announced, decimation. The word itself comes from the Latin decimus, meaning 10th. And that's precisely what is about to happen to 1 in 10 of you. The unit is divided into groups of 10. You find yourself standing with 9 other men you fought, marched, and perhaps even shared your meager rations with. You look at their faces, fear, desperation, maybe even a flicker of anger or resentment. You are about to participate in a lottery where the prize is your life, and the forfeit is a brutal, horrifying death, dealt out by the hands of those standing right next to you. Lots are drawn. Perhaps names are written on slips of pottery or wood and placed into a helmet. A tribune, or maybe even one of your own centurions, reaches in. Every soldier holds their breath. The name is called. It's not you. A wave of nauseating relief washes over you, immediately followed by a fresh surge of horror as you see whose name was called. It's one of the 9 men in your group. He stands there, perhaps frozen in disbelief, his face draining of color. Now comes the truly awful part. The other 9 soldiers in that group, you included, are ordered to execute the 10th man. He is often beaten to death with clubs or stones by his own comrades. Imagine that moment. You are given a heavy club. You look at the man you are meant to kill. He might be your friend, someone you saved in battle, someone who saved you. But the alternative? Refuse to participate, and you might find yourself facing the same fate, or worse, for insubordination. The officers and centurions are watching, their faces grim and unforgiving. So you raise the club. And you strike. And the others strike. It's a forced act of collective brutality, designed not just to kill the unlucky 10th man, but to implicate everyone else in the horror. It binds the survivors together in a shared, terrible secret, a stain that can never be washed away. The air fills with the sickening sounds of the beating, the cries of the victim, and the strained grunts of the men forced to carry out the punishment. It's a scene of utter barbarity, carried out with cold, calculated efficiency. The bodies of the slain are then often left unburied, a final indignity. And for the survivors of the decimated unit? Their punishment isn't over. They are typically given barley rations instead of the usual wheat, a humiliating diet usually reserved for animals or slaves. They might also be forced to camp outside the main fortifications, exposed and vulnerable, as a further mark of their disgrace. This wasn't just about physical punishment. It was about breaking the unit's pride, stripping away their privileges, and making them outcasts even within the military community. It was the ultimate walk of shame, fueled by regret and barley. Why such an extreme measure? Decimation wasn't a daily occurrence, thankfully. It was reserved for the most serious breaches of military conduct, particularly cowardice on a large scale, or outright mutiny. A mainstream historical fact is that decimation was a punishment used by the Roman army for severe offenses by entire units, intended to restore discipline through terror and collective responsibility. It wasn't about finding the single most guilty individual. It was about punishing the unit as a whole and ensuring that the fear of this random, brutal lottery would prevent future failures. If you knew that your cowardice might not only lead to your own death, but the random selection and brutal killing of one of your friends by the hands of your other friends, you might think twice before running away. A quirky or fringe tidbit about decimation is that while it's most famously associated with larger units like cohorts, around 480 men, meaning about 48 would die, it could theoretically be applied to smaller groups of 10 if their offense warranted it, though historical accounts focus more on the larger scale application. Imagine being in a squad of 10 and having one chance in 10 of not surviving the day, simply because your buddy tripped and dropped his shield. Probably not quite like that, but the randomness was key. Historians still argue whether decimation was a common practice or a rare, extreme measure used only in dire circumstances and primarily as a deterrent. Some ancient sources describe it happening multiple times throughout Roman history, often during periods of severe military crisis or widespread insubordination. Others suggest it was used so infrequently precisely because it was so horrific and potentially damaging to unit morale in the long run, even if it instilled immediate terror. Was it a go-to move or a last resort? The debate continues, but the chilling fact remains that it was used. The psychological impact on the survivors must have been immense. Forced to kill a comrade, then live with the memory, branded by the barley rations and the exposed camp. Decimation wasn't just a punishment, it was a ritual of terror that reinforced the absolute power of the commanders and the unforgiving nature of Roman military law. It was a stark reminder that in the legions, your life wasn't entirely your own, and your fate could be decided by a random draw of lots and the unwilling hands of your friends. A truly grim form of team building, wouldn't you say? Leaving the grim assembly ground where the random terror of decimation unfolded, we stay in Rome, but shift our focus from the military to the heart of the city itself, to a place of ancient legend and brutal, final justice. Imagine the Capitoline Hill, one of the 7 hills of Rome, the seat of temples and power. It's a place of grandeur, but it also held a dark secret, a sheer cliff face overlooking the Forum, known as the Tarpeian Rock, *Rupes Tarpeia*. This wasn't just a geological feature, it was a designated execution site, a place where the condemned met their end not by sword or beast, but by gravity. For certain crimes, particularly those seen as betrayals of the state or violations of sacred oaths, your final journey might be a very short, very fast one, straight down. Imagine yourself being led through the busy streets of Rome, perhaps after being convicted of treason, perjury, or even certain types of theft that were considered particularly heinous. Unlike the spectacle of the arena, this punishment was perhaps less drawn out, but no less terrifying in its finality. You'd be escorted by guards to the top of the Capitoline Hill, the sounds of the city fading behind you, replaced by the wind whistling around the ancient buildings. As you approach the edge, you get a sickening view of the ground far, far below. The people in the Forum look like tiny ants. This is where your story ends. The story of the Tarpeian Rock is intertwined with Roman legend. It's named after Tarpeia, daughter of the commander of the Roman citadel on the Capitoline Hill during the legendary Sabine seizure of Rome. According to the tale, she betrayed the Romans to the Sabines in exchange for what the Sabines wore on their left arms. She meant their gold bracelets. The Sabines, however, crushed her to death with their shields, which they also wore on their left arms. A classic case of be careful what you wish for, or perhaps read the fine print. Her body was supposedly thrown from the rock, and ever since, it became associated with traitors and their fate. Whether the legend is true or not, the rock became a very real place of execution. You are brought to the edge. There's no elaborate ceremony, no sack, no cross. Just you, the guards, and the dizzying height. Your hands might be bound. You might be stripped of your clothes, another layer of humiliation before death. The wind whips at your face. You can hear the birds circling far below. This is it. The final moments. A mainstream historical fact about the Tarpeian Rock is that it was used as an execution site in ancient Rome for centuries, primarily for crimes considered particularly heinous or sacrilegious, such as treason and perjury. It was a swift, brutal form of capital punishment, often reserved for those deemed enemies of the state, or who had committed acts that violated fundamental Roman values or oaths. The guards grasp you, perhaps one on each arm, or maybe they simply shove you forward. There's no time to brace yourself, no time for a final plea. You are propelled over the edge. Now let's try, uncomfortably, to imagine the fall from the second-person perspective. For a brief moment, you might feel a sickening lurch in your stomach, the rush of air against your body. The ground below rushes up with terrifying speed. The buildings you saw from above are now blurring into streaks of color. There's the initial shock, the brief, terrifying sensation of weightlessness, followed almost immediately by the crushing realization of your fate. You might scream, or maybe the air is knocked out of you instantly. Your life might flash before your eyes, or maybe your brain is simply overwhelmed by the sheer, primal terror of falling. The wind screams past your ears. Everything is a blur. This is not a controlled descent, it's a violent, uncontrolled plunge towards the unyielding earth below. It's the ultimate trust fall, except nobody's catching you. Historians still argue whether the height of the Tarpeian Rock was consistently used for executions throughout Roman history, or if factors like erosion or changes in the ground level below might have altered its lethality over time. While ancient sources describe it as a sheer drop, the exact height and its consistency as a guaranteed fatal fall are debated. Some accounts suggest that occasionally people did survive the fall, although they would likely be severely injured and might face further punishment anyway. The fall itself would only last a few seconds, maybe less, depending on the exact height and angle. But in those seconds, time might seem to stretch, every nerve ending screaming in terror. And then, impact. The fall would end abruptly and violently, your body striking the ground or the rocks at the base of the cliff. Death would likely be instantaneous from massive trauma. It was a messy, public end, leaving the broken body at the foot of the rock for all to see. A quirky or fringe tidbit relates to the Gemoni Scali, stairs of mourning, a set of steps leading down from the Capitoline Hill near the Forum. The bodies of criminals executed at the Tarpeian Rock were sometimes displayed on these stairs for a period before being dragged away and thrown into the Tiber River. Imagine walking past those stairs on your way to the Forum to do some shopping, and seeing bodies left out as a grim warning. Talk about a buzzkill. The public nature of the execution from the Tarpeian Rock was, like many Roman punishments, crucial. It wasn't hidden away. The rock overlooked a central public space, the Forum. Anyone in the Forum, or on the surrounding hills, could potentially witness the execution. It was a stark, visual demonstration of the consequences of betraying Rome. You literally fell from grace, from the very heart of Roman power on the Capitoline Hill, down to the ground below, your body becoming a symbol of the state's unforgiving justice. It was a clear message: violate sacred trusts, and you will be cast down, utterly and permanently. It makes modern public shaming look like a gentle nudge. While perhaps less elaborately cruel than the sack or as drawn out as crucifixion, the Tarpeian rock offered a unique form of terror, the primal fear of falling, amplified by the knowledge that it was a deliberate act of the state. It was a punishment rooted in ancient legend and maintained for centuries as a symbol of Roman authority, and its willingness to literally cast out those who betrayed its core principles. It wasn't just death. It was a symbolic fall from the heights of Roman society, ending in a broken heap at the base of the very hill that represented Rome's power and glory. A truly rock-bottom experience, in the most literal sense. Leaving the bone-shattering finality of the Tarpeian rock behind us, we drift south, following the currents of history down the Mediterranean coast and into the scorching heat of ancient Egypt. Forget the grand pyramids and the serene Nile for a moment, and imagine a different side of the pharaoh's justice. While the Egyptians built monumental tombs and worshipped complex pantheons, they also had some rather permanent ways of dealing with lawbreakers, often involving the reshaping of the human form itself. We're talking about physical mutilation, a punishment designed not just to inflict pain, but to mark you for life, a walking, visible testament to your crime. Imagine finding yourself before an Egyptian court, perhaps accused of theft, perjury, or even something like forging documents. The verdict comes down, and instead of a prison sentence or a death decree, you hear a chilling pronouncement involving your nose, or your ears, or maybe even your hands. This wasn't just symbolic. It was a physical act of removal, carried out publicly, ensuring that everyone who saw you from that day forward would know you had fallen afoul of the law. Picture the scene. You're brought out into the dusty square, the sun beating down, reflecting off the white robes of the officials and the bronze tools held by the executioner. A crowd gathers, their faces a mix of fear, pity, and grim curiosity. The air is dry and still, amplifying the sounds, the shuffling feet, the murmurs of the onlookers, and the cold, metallic glint of the instrument about to be used. There's no dramatic scaffold or roaring beasts, just a simple block or stool, and the chilling presence of the person holding the knife or chisel. The specific body part targeted often related symbolically to the crime. Stolen goods? Say goodbye to your hands? Caught spreading lies or listening in on forbidden conversations? Your ears might be on the chopping block. Forgery or giving false testimony? Perhaps your tongue would be forfeit. And for certain sexual offenses or other crimes considered deeply shameful, the punishment could involve the removal of the nose, a particularly disfiguring act that made hiding your past virtually impossible. Imagine trying to blend in with a new look after that. "Excuse me, sir, have you seen my nose?" Probably not the best conversation starter. Let's focus on the removal of hands, a common punishment for theft. You would be forced to place your hand on a block. The executioner would raise their tool, perhaps a heavy knife or chisel. There was no anesthetic, of course. Just the searing pain as the blade came down, severing flesh, muscle, and bone. The blood would spurt onto the dusty ground. The initial shock might be overwhelming, perhaps leading to unconsciousness, but you'd likely be revived quickly enough to experience the aftermath. The wound would be cauterized, possibly with a hot iron, to stop the bleeding, another layer of agonizing pain. Then you were left with a stump, a constant, painful reminder of your crime and its consequence. A mainstream historical fact about ancient Egyptian justice is that physical mutilation, such as the removal of hands, ears, or the nose, was a common punishment for various crimes, particularly theft, perjury, and insubordination. This practice is documented in ancient texts and depicted in some tomb paintings, showing that it was a recognized part of their legal system. The removal of ears was another frequent punishment. Imagine the sharp snip as the blade cuts through cartilage and skin. It might not be as immediately debilitating as losing a hand, but it was highly visible, especially in a society where people might wear elaborate headdresses or wigs that wouldn't fully conceal the loss. It was a punishment for those who heard too much or spread harmful gossip. You might find yourself constantly adjusting your headwear, trying to hide the missing lobe, knowing that anyone who noticed would instantly judge you. The removal of the nose was perhaps the most disfiguring and therefore the most shameful. The nose was a prominent feature, central to the face. Its removal left a gaping hole, instantly marking you as someone who had committed a grave offense. This punishment was sometimes used for repeat offenders or for crimes considered especially contemptible. Imagine trying to live a normal life, find work, or interact socially when your face was a constant advertisement for your criminal history. It was a living ostracism, a permanent exile from respectability. You'd probably have to get really good at knitting face coverings. Historians still argue whether specific mutilations were strictly codified for particular crimes across the entire span of Egyptian history, or if the severity and type of mutilation varied depending on the period, the specific pharaoh, the local judge, or even the social status of the offender. While general patterns existed, hands for theft, the precise application might have been less uniform than some records suggest, leaving some room for judicial discretion, or perhaps just arbitrary cruelty. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to Egyptian mutilation is the existence of specific settlements or areas where people who had suffered mutilations, particularly the loss of their noses, were sometimes sent to live. One such place was called Rhinocolura, meaning cut off noses, in Greek, located on the border with Syria. It was essentially a colony for the disfigured, a place where those permanently marked by Egyptian justice were sent, perhaps to live out their days away from the general population, reinforcing their status as outcasts. Imagine being sent to a town where everyone has the same distinguishing feature. Probably wouldn't need name tags at the town hall meeting. The purpose of these mutilations went beyond simple retribution. It was a powerful form of deterrence, a terrifying warning to others. If you knew that stealing a loaf of bread could cost you a hand, you might think twice. It was also about public shaming and social control. A person with a missing hand, ear, or nose was instantly identifiable as a criminal. They were stripped of their anonymity and forced to carry their punishment visibly for the rest of their lives. This made it difficult to reoffend, difficult to find honest work, and difficult to escape the stigma. You were literally branded by your crime, not with a hot iron, but with the absence of a body part. Think about the long-term consequences. Living with a missing hand in an ancient world where manual labor was essential would have made survival incredibly challenging. Living with a disfigured face would have made social interaction difficult and humiliating. These punishments weren't just about ending a life. They were often about ending a life as you knew it, forcing you into a marginalized, often desperate existence. It was a slow, living death of social standing and physical capability. While the Egyptians didn't have the elaborate, symbolic animal sack or the drawn-out agony of the cross in quite the same way as the Romans, their focus on permanent physical alteration as punishment was equally chilling. It highlights a different cultural approach to justice, one that prioritized public visibility, lasting shame, and the creation of a permanently marked underclass. It makes you appreciate that even a bad tattoo is reversible, doesn't it? A truly stark reminder that in the land of the pharaohs, breaking the law could leave you with a lot less of yourself than you started with. Leaving the land of permanent disfigurement behind, we journey eastwards, following the ancient trade routes towards the Fertile Crescent, the cradle of civilization, and the realm of one of history's most famous, and famously harsh, lawgivers, Hammurabi of Babylon. Step back in time to the 18th century BC, to a bustling city of ziggurats and mud-brick houses, where life was governed by a set of laws carved into stone, a code that promised justice, but often delivered it with bone-chilling severity. If you thought losing a hand for theft in Egypt was rough, buckle up, because Hammurabi had some equally, if not more, brutal ideas about keeping order. Imagine living under the shadow of the Code of Hammurabi, a towering basalt stele inscribed with 282 laws, placed in a public square for all to see, though, granted, not everyone could read. This wasn't just a list of rules, it was the king's decree, handed down from the gods, according to the prologue, designed to protect the weak and dispense impartial justice. The core principle? Lex talionis, the law of retaliation, famously summarized as an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Sounds fair, right? Well, sort of. It turns out that whole eye for an eye thing had some serious caveats, particularly depending on who you were. You see, while the principle of equal retaliation was there, its application was anything but equal across all social classes. If you, a member of the upper class, an Awilum, knocked out the eye of another Awilum, guess what? You'd likely lose an eye too. But if you knocked out the eye of a commoner, muscanum*, or a slave, *wardum*, the penalty wasn't losing your own eye. It was usually just a fine. Yep, your eye was worth less if you weren't a noble. So much for impartial justice, unless, of course, you were a noble fighting another noble. Then it was strictly quid pro quo, or perhaps quid pro eyeball. But beyond the class-based eye gouging, the code laid out some truly harsh physical penalties for a wide range of offenses. Imagine the sheer terror of being accused of striking your father. In Babylonian society, the authority of the father was absolute, much like the Roman paterfamilias. Defying or physically harming him was an attack on the very fabric of society. The punishment? Your hand, the offending limb, would be cut off. Picture the scene: the public square, the crowd, the block, the swift, final swing of an axe or heavy knife. Just like in Egypt, you'd be left permanently maimed, a living reminder of your transgression. Hopefully, you weren't planning on becoming a concert pianist. Or consider the crime of slandering a priestess. Priestesses held a high and respected, often sacred, position in Babylonian society. To falsely accuse one could undermine religious authority and social stability. The punishment for such calumny, if proven false? Your tongue would be cut out. Imagine the horror of being silenced forever, unable to speak, unable to defend yourself, your tongue removed as punishment for misuse of speech. It's a chillingly literal interpretation of justice, isn't it? A bit more extreme than just being sent to Twitter jail. Adultery was another crime with severe physical consequences, particularly for the married woman and her lover. According to the code, if a married woman was caught in the act with another man, both of them were to be bound and thrown into the river, drowning together. It was a public, swift, and utterly final judgment on a breach of marital fidelity. There were provisions that the king could pardon them, or the husband could choose to spare his wife, in which case the king would likely spare the lover, but the default punishment carved into stone was a watery grave. Talk about a relationship going downhill fast. Theft, especially theft from a temple or the palace, was met with extreme brutality. If you stole from a temple or palace, you weren't just fined or imprisoned. You and anyone who received the stolen goods from you were to be put to death. Not just any death, but often death by burning. Imagine being tied to a stake, the flames licking at your feet, the smoke filling your lungs. It was a terrifyingly painful and public execution, a clear message about the sanctity of religious and royal property. Better stick to stealing grapes from your neighbor's vine, maybe they just give you a stern talking to. A mainstream historical fact about the Code of Hammurabi is that it wasn't just a list of punishments. It covered a vast array of legal matters, including property rights, contracts, family law, and even regulations for builders and doctors. It was a comprehensive attempt to codify the laws of the land, providing a framework for judges to follow and establishing a degree of legal precedent, even if the penalties were often harsh by modern standards. A quirky or fringe tidbit from the code is Law 229, which deals with a builder constructing a house that collapses and kills the owner. In this case, the builder is put to death. But if the collapse kills the owner's son, the builder's son is put to death. This is another example of the eye for an eye principle extended to family members, a concept known as vicarious punishment, where guilt and consequence could transfer to relatives. Imagine explaining that one to your kid. Sorry, son, turns out Dad's house collapsed and killed Mr. Henderson's boy, so, yeah, pack a bag. Historians still argue whether the Code of Hammurabi was a set of laws regularly applied in courts throughout the Babylonian Empire, or if it was primarily a monument, a declaration of Hammurabi's wisdom and justice intended more for propaganda and historical legacy than daily legal practice. While legal documents from the period show that judges did reference aspects of the code, the extent to which its specific, often brutal, penalties were consistently enforced is a subject of ongoing debate among scholars. The purpose behind these harsh physical penalties was clear: deterrence and retribution. By inflicting severe, often irreversible physical harm, the code aimed to make the consequences of breaking the law so terrifying that people wouldn't even consider it. It also served the principle of retribution. The punishment should fit the crime, even if that meant literally taking the body part involved in the offense. It was a system that prioritized order and authority through fear, where your physical integrity was constantly at stake if you stepped out of line. So, as you contemplate the justice system of ancient Babylon, picture the stone steel, the list of offenses, and the swift, brutal consequences: the severed hand, the silenced tongue, the shared watery grave, the searing flames. It's a stark reminder that one of history's earliest attempts at codified law was built on a foundation of physical pain and social hierarchy, where the price of an eye, or a life, depended very much on who you were. A truly heavy code to live under, wouldn't you agree? Leaving the brutal world of Babylonian retribution, where justice was often literally carved into your flesh or ended with a splash, we journey westward across the ancient seas to the bustling heart of classical Greece, to the city-state of Athens. Here, we find a different kind of punishment, one that wasn't about physical pain or a swift, violent end, but about social exclusion and political maneuverings. This was ostracism, a uniquely Athenian method of dealing with individuals deemed too powerful, too popular, or simply too much of a potential threat to the nascent democracy. Imagine being banished from your home, your city, your friends, and your political life, not for committing a specific crime, but because enough of your fellow citizens simply voted you off the island, or rather, out of Attica. Picture yourself living in Athens in the 5th century BC. You're a prominent citizen, maybe a successful general, a charismatic politician, or just someone who's gained a lot of influence. You attend the assembly, you debate, you participate in the life of the polis. Life is good. But there's a catch. Once a year, the Athenian assembly had the option to hold a special vote. This wasn't a vote on a law or a policy. It was a vote on who should be ostracized. The process was remarkably democratic, in a terrifying sort of way. First, the assembly would decide if they wanted to hold an ostracism vote that year. If they said yes, a date would be set, usually in the marketplace, the agora. On the appointed day, citizens would gather. Each citizen who wished to participate would take a shard of pottery, called an ostracon. These were essentially broken pieces of ceramic, readily available throughout the city. On this ostracon, you would scratch or write the name of the person you believed should be ostracized. Not the crime they committed, because there often wasn't one, but just their name. Now, imagine standing in line with thousands of other citizens, each holding a piece of broken pot with someone's name on it. You walk past a designated area, perhaps guarded by officials, and deposit your ostracon into a large urn or a marked-off space. The tension in the air must have been palpable. Were people voting for you? Were they voting for your political rival? Were they just voting for the guy who always talks too loud at the assembly? You wouldn't know until the votes were counted. The counting was a public affair. Officials would sort through the ostraca. For an ostracism to actually happen, a minimum threshold of votes was required. Usually 6,000 ostraca had to be cast in total. If fewer than 6,000 votes were cast, the ostracism was invalid, and no one was exiled that year. If more than 6,000 votes were cast, the person whose name appeared on the most ostraca was the one who got the boot. It didn't matter if they were innocent of any specific crime. The will of the assembly, expressed through these humble pottery shards, was final. It was like a reality show, but with higher stakes and less dramatic editing. And the person leaving Athens tonight, eyes. Themistocles. Once the votes were tallied and the winner of the ostracism was announced, you, the condemned, had a limited time, usually 10 days, to wrap up your affairs. You weren't stripped of your citizenship, and crucially, you usually retained your property. This was a key difference from other forms of banishment or execution where everything was confiscated. The idea wasn't to ruin you financially, but to remove your physical presence and influence from the city for a set period. Within those 10 days, you had to leave Attica, the region around Athens, and stay away for 10 years. Imagine that walk to the port, perhaps the Piraeus. You're not in chains, but you're escorted, a public figure suddenly reduced to an exile. You say goodbye to your family, your friends, your political allies. You board a ship, not knowing exactly where you'll go or what you'll do for the next decade. You might head to another Greek city-state, perhaps one that's a rival of Athens, which could make things awkward when your 10 years are up. You're effectively in political timeout, sent to your room, a room somewhere far away, for 10 years. The purpose of ostracism, at least in theory, was to safeguard the democracy from potential tyrants or individuals whose power and popularity might destabilize the state. A mainstream historical fact about Greek ostracism is that it was introduced in Athens around 508 BC, attributed to the reforms of Cleisthenes, as a mechanism to prevent the rise of individuals who might seize power and become tyrants, by allowing citizens to preemptively exile such threats. It was a safety valve, a way to get rid of someone before they became a real problem, without resorting to execution or civil war. However, like any political tool, ostracism could be, and was, abused. Over time, it became less about preventing tyranny and more about settling political scores between powerful factions. Two prominent politicians or their supporters might essentially campaign to have the other guy ostracized. It became a contest of popularity and influence, a way to sideline a rival for 10 years and consolidate your own power. Imagine the political ads. Vote for me, or vote to send my opponent to Sparta. Your choice. Historians still argue whether ostracism was an effective tool for maintaining democracy or if it ultimately weakened Athens by removing talented individuals based on political rivalries rather than actual wrongdoing. Some argue it successfully prevented tyranny for a period, while others point to instances where capable leaders were exiled, arguably to the detriment of the city, especially during times of war. Was it a brilliant democratic innovation or a politically motivated weapon? The debate continues. A quirky or fringe tidbit about ostracism involves the ostraca themselves. While many were inscribed by the citizen casting the vote, evidence suggests that in some cases, ostraca with the names of prominent individuals already written on them were mass-produced and distributed, presumably by political groups or individuals wishing to influence the vote. Imagine finding a pile of pre-printed ballots with your opponent's name on them, ancient political campaigning at its finest, or perhaps its most manipulative. Some surviving ostraca even have misspelled names, suggesting either illiteracy among some voters or perhaps hasty scribbling. Being ostracized wasn't a death sentence, and it wasn't necessarily a life of destitution, especially if you were wealthy enough to live comfortably elsewhere. Many prominent Athenians who were ostracized, like Themistocles, a hero of the Persian Wars, or Aristides the Just, eventually returned to Athens after their 10 years were up, sometimes even playing a role in public life again. It was a severe disruption, a public humiliation, and a period of enforced absence, but it wasn't the end of your life or career. Compared to the physical horrors we've explored, the sack, the beasts, the cross, the mutilations, the Code of Hammurabi, ostracism feels almost civilized? It was a punishment of presence, of influence, of belonging. You weren't physically harmed, but you were told, by thousands of your fellow citizens, that they didn't want you around. For someone whose life revolved around the political and social sphere of Athens, this psychological and social exile could be profoundly damaging, a form of living death for your public identity. It makes being unfriended on social media feel like a gentle pat on the back. So, as you contemplate Athenian justice, think of the pottery shards, the counting of votes, and the long walk to the ship. Ostracism was a bizarre product of a direct democracy grappling with the power of individuals, a system where popularity and perceived threat, not just criminal actions, could lead to banishment. It was a punishment by public opinion, codified into law, a unique blend of democratic process and political exile. A truly strange way to handle your political rivals, but hey, at least nobody lost a hand. Leaving the perhaps less physically brutal, though still profoundly unsettling, world of Athenian social exile and those potentially pre-written pottery shards, we now take a much darker turn, heading east again, this time towards the vast and powerful Persian Empire. Prepare yourself, because this next punishment is widely considered one of the most horrific ever devised, a method of execution that combined exposure, immobility, and the slow, agonizing work of nature itself. We're talking about scaphism, sometimes called the boats. If you thought being tossed off a cliff or eaten by a lion was bad, imagine being eaten alive, piece by piece, over days, even weeks, by insects and vermin, all while trapped and force-fed. Yeah, sweet dreams indeed. Imagine yourself condemned in ancient Persia, perhaps for treason, murder, or some other high crime against the King of Kings. Your fate is not a swift sword or a public hanging. Instead, you are brought to a place of execution, maybe a riverbank or a quiet, isolated spot. Waiting there are two boats, or sometimes hollowed-out tree trunks, crafted to fit together. One boat serves as a bottom, the other as a lid. You are placed inside the bottom boat, lying on your back. Your head is likely left protruding from one end, and your feet from the other. Sometimes your limbs might also be intentionally left exposed or secured in place. The second boat is then inverted and placed on top of the first, fitting snugly around you. You are now encased, essentially trapped between the two vessels, unable to move, unable to escape. It's like being put into a very custom, very uncomfortable, and deeply terrifying sarcophagus. But the immobility is just the beginning. To ensure the process is drawn out and utterly agonizing, you are force-fed. Yes, you read that right. Your captors will regularly provide you with milk and honey, sometimes mixed together. This isn't an act of mercy, it's an act of deliberate cruelty. The goal is to keep you alive, to prolong your suffering, and to make you produce waste. The milk and honey mixture is designed to induce severe diarrhea. So you lie there, trapped, exposed, and fed a diet that causes your body to become a constant source of waste. The boats, or troughs, have no drainage. Your own excrement begins to accumulate within the confined space around you. The sweet, sticky milk and honey smeared on your face and body, and the growing filth within the boats, create the perfect breeding ground and attractant for insects. Swarms of flies, attracted by the smell, would descend upon you. They would land on your exposed skin, your face, feeding on the milk and honey, the sweat, and eventually, the waste. And where flies go, maggots follow. Imagine the sensation, the constant buzzing, the tickling of countless tiny feet on your skin, the inevitable biting and stinging, and then the chilling realization as you feel movement beneath the surface of the filth accumulating around you. Maggots would hatch and begin to feed, not just on the waste, but on your living flesh, particularly in areas where the skin was broken or softened by moisture and exposure. The smell would become unimaginable, a sickening combination of milk, honey, sweat, and decaying waste, attracting more flies, more insects, more vermin. A mainstream historical fact about scaphism is that it is described by the Greek writer Plutarch in his biography of Artaxerxes II, detailing its use by the Persians as a particularly cruel form of capital punishment. While accounts are primarily from Greek sources, they paint a consistent, horrifying picture of this method of execution. The agony wasn't just from being eaten alive. You were also exposed to the elements, the sun beating down, the cold at night, unable to shelter yourself. You would suffer from dehydration, heat stroke, or hypothermia. The constant exposure to your own waste would lead to infections, gangrene, and disease. The psychological torment of being utterly helpless, trapped, and slowly consumed by insects and vermin must have been immense, perhaps even worse than the physical pain. You couldn't sweat the flies, couldn't wipe away the filth, couldn't escape the horror unfolding upon your own body. It was a living nightmare, drawn out over days. Some accounts claim victims could last for 2 weeks or more in this state before finally succumbing. Historians still argue about the exact prevalence and details of scaphism. Was it a widely used punishment, or a rare, extreme measure reserved for the most hated enemies of the state, perhaps exaggerated by Greek writers who were often hostile to the Persians. While Plutarch's account is detailed, other sources are less explicit, leading some scholars to question how common or standardized the practice truly was across the vast Persian Empire. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to scaphism is the specific mention of milk and honey being used for force feeding. While intended to cause diarrhea and attract insects, some interpretations suggest a twisted symbolism. Milk and honey were often associated with blessings, fertility, and abundance in ancient cultures. To use these substances in such a horrific context adds another layer of psychological perversion to the punishment, turning symbols of life and sweetness into instruments of a slow, putrid death. It's like being force-fed wedding cake until you die of dysentery, but way worse. The purpose of scaphism was likely multifaceted. It was undoubtedly a powerful deterrent, a punishment so terrifying that the mere thought of it would discourage dissent. It was also a form of ultimate dehumanization, reducing the condemned to a mere vessel for decay and consumption by lower life forms. It was a complete negation of the individual, a slow, public disintegration that left nothing but a horrifying memory. It wasn't just about ending a life quickly. It was about maximizing suffering and degradation over the longest possible period. Imagine the stories that would spread about someone who died this way. They would become cautionary tales whispered in terrified voices across the empire. Compared to the swift drop from the Tarpeian Rock or even the relatively quicker end in the Roman arena, scaphism was a punishment of exquisite, prolonged cruelty. It didn't require complex machinery or large numbers of executioners. Just 2 boats, some food, and the willingness to let nature, in its most unpleasant forms, do the rest. It stands as a chilling testament to the depths of human ingenuity when applied to the task of inflicting suffering, a truly horrific intersection of immobility, exposure, and biological torment. It makes you appreciate modern pest control, doesn't it? A truly buggy way to go. Leaving the truly disturbing, slow, biological horror of scaphism behind, we move forward in history, into the European Middle Ages, a time often romanticized with knights and castles, but also a period known for its particularly brutal and public forms of punishment. Forget slow decay by insects. Here, justice often involved more direct, visceral methods, designed to inflict maximum pain and serve as terrifying public spectacles. 2 methods stand out for their sheer cruelty: death by boiling, and the agony of being broken on the wheel. Imagine finding yourself accused of a crime in, say, 16th century England, or perhaps the Holy Roman Empire. Not just any crime, but something particularly heinous in the eyes of the law, like poisoning someone, counterfeiting currency, seen as a betrayal of the state, or even certain forms of murder. Your fate might be decided not by a hangman's noose, but by a large cauldron filled with liquid, heated over a fire. Yes, you heard that right. Boiling alive. Picture the scene. A public square, a large metal cauldron set up over a roaring fire, perhaps suspended from a gallows-like structure. The liquid inside could be water, oil, tar, or even lead, depending on the location and the specific nature of the crime. Steam rises from the pot, carrying a sickening smell that mingles with the stench of the crowd. You are brought forward, perhaps stripped naked or clad only in a thin shift. The heat radiating from the fire is intense, a terrifying preview of what's to come. You are then lowered into the cauldron. This could be done quickly, or agonizingly slowly, perhaps by a mechanism that gradually dips you into the liquid. Imagine the initial shock as your body hits the scalding liquid, the searing pain as your skin instantly blisters and peels away. If the liquid is boiling, death might occur relatively quickly from shock and organ failure, but it would be an excruciating few minutes. If the liquid is heated more slowly, the agony would be prolonged, a slow, torturous cooking from the outside in. Your screams would fill the square, a horrifying sound that the crowd would witness, a stark warning of the consequences of your actions. It's like the world's worst hot tub experience, where the bubbles are made of your own flesh. A mainstream historical fact about boiling as a punishment is that it was used in various parts of Europe, particularly in the late Middle Ages and early modern period, often for crimes like poisoning, counterfeiting, or treason. It was considered a particularly severe and degrading form of execution. Now, let's shift to another horrific method, breaking on the wheel, also known as the Catherine wheel. This punishment was primarily used in parts of Europe, notably France, Germany, and the Holy Roman Empire, for serious crimes like murder, highway robbery, and sometimes even arson. It was designed to inflict a slow, agonizing death through the systematic breaking of the condemned's bones. Imagine you are the condemned, tied spread eagle onto a large wooden wheel, similar to a cartwheel, laid flat on the ground or sometimes mounted upright. Your limbs are stretched out along the spokes. The executioner stands over you, not with an axe or a sword, but with a heavy iron bar or a large wooden club. The process begins. The executioner systematically strikes your limbs with the bar, breaking your bones, your arms, your legs, perhaps even your ribs. Each blow would send unimaginable pain through your body. You would feel your bones shatter, hear the sickening crunch, and the pain would be relentless. The goal wasn't necessarily to kill you instantly, but to break every major bone in your body while keeping you alive. Imagine being utterly immobilized, your limbs twisted and broken, in excruciating pain, fully conscious. It's like a truly terrible yoga session that never ends. After your bones were broken, you would often be left tied to the wheel, which might be raised onto a pole or displayed publicly. Exposed to the elements, suffering from shock, dehydration, and the immense trauma, you would slowly die. This could take hours, sometimes even days. Birds might peck at you, insects might swarm. It was a prolonged, public display of suffering designed to terrify onlookers and serve as a powerful deterrent. Sometimes, as a final act of mercy, or perhaps just to clear the wheel, the executioner might deliver a final blow to the chest or neck, known as a coup de grace. Stroke of mercy, to end your suffering more quickly. But this wasn't always granted. Historians still argue whether breaking on the wheel was always a slow death, or if executioners sometimes aimed for a quicker end, perhaps out of pity or instruction. While the intent was often prolonged agony, the reality of the executioner's skill, the victim's constitution, and local customs likely meant the duration of suffering varied considerably. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to breaking on the wheel is that in some regions, the condemned was woven through the spokes of the wheel after being broken, their broken limbs threaded between the wood, creating a gruesome, permanent display. Imagine the contortions required, even with broken bones, to achieve this macabre arrangement. The purpose of both boiling and breaking was similar to other public, brutal punishments: deterrence, retribution, and spectacle. They were designed to inflict maximum pain and suffering on the condemned, making their death a horrifying example for others. They were also seen as particularly degrading forms of death, emphasizing the criminality and low status of the offender. In a time without mass media, these public executions were powerful tools of social control, grim theater designed to reinforce the power of the state and the consequences of defying its laws. You didn't just die, you were destroyed publicly, your body becoming a cautionary tale. It makes jury duty seem positively relaxing. These methods highlight a different kind of cruelty compared to Roman or Babylonian justice. Less focused on symbolic mutilation or random selection, and more on direct, prolonged physical torment and public display of the shattered body. They serve as a stark reminder that the Middle Ages, for all its cultural achievements, could be incredibly harsh when it came to dealing with those who broke the law, finding creative and brutal ways to end lives publicly and painfully. A truly broken way to go, in every sense of the word. Leaving the shattered bones and boiling cauldrons of medieval Europe behind, we now turn our gaze towards England, specifically to a punishment reserved for the most heinous crime against the crown: high treason. If you were a man convicted of plotting against the king, levying war against him, or aiding his enemies, your fate was codified into a series of brutal, public acts designed to inflict maximum suffering and humiliation, both in life and, disturbingly, even after death. This was the punishment of drawing and quartering, a fate so gruesome it became synonymous with the ultimate act of state retribution. Imagine yourself standing trial for high treason in, say, the 14th or 15th century. The verdict is read, and the judge pronounces the sentence. It's not just death, it's a specific, multi-part process designed to utterly destroy you. The first part of the sentence is drawing. This didn't mean drawing a picture of you being punished, though that probably happened later. It meant being dragged. You would be tied to a hurdle, a kind of wooden frame or sled, and pulled by a horse through the streets from the prison to the execution site. Imagine the rough ride, the cobblestones jarring your body, the jeering crowds lining the route, spitting on you, throwing refuse. Your clothes might be torn, your skin scraped raw. It was a public parade of your disgrace, a living, breathing warning to everyone who saw you pass. Think of it as the world's worst, most uncomfortable limousine service, with a horse instead of a driver and a destination you absolutely do not want to reach. Upon arriving at the execution site, usually Tyburn in London or another prominent public place, the real horror began. The second part of the sentence was hanging, but not to death. You would be hanged from the gallows, but cut down while you were still alive, often just before losing consciousness. The hangman's skill, or lack thereof, was crucial here. Too long on the rope and you might die. Too short and you'd be fully alert for the next stages. Imagine the feeling of the rope tightening around your neck, the struggle for breath, the world going dark, only to be suddenly released, gasping for air, bruised and terrified, knowing the worst was yet to come. Now comes the drawing part again, but this time it refers to disemboweling. While you were still conscious, or at least semi-conscious and in immense pain from the brief hanging, the executioner would cut open your abdomen and remove your intestines and other internal organs. Yes, while you were alive. Imagine the searing pain of the blade, the sickening sensation as your insides were pulled out, the smell of your own body being violated. It was a deliberate act of unimaginable cruelty, designed to inflict maximum agony and ensure your suffering was prolonged and public. It makes that time you had food poisoning seem like a pleasant afternoon nap. But it didn't stop there. Your genitals would often be cut off and burned before your eyes. A final, humiliating act of emasculation and destruction of your ability to procreate, emphasizing the state's utter contempt for you and your lineage. Imagine the pain, the horror, the ultimate indignity, all happening while you are still clinging to life. Finally, your head would be cut off. This was often done while you were still alive after the disemboweling, though sometimes the decapitation might occur after you had finally succumbed to shock and blood loss. The body, now headless and disemboweled, would then be quartered, cut into 4 pieces. This was usually done by hacking the torso into 4 parts, often at the limbs or joints. Imagine the gruesome sight, the final dismemberment, reducing the human body to bloody chunks. A mainstream historical fact about drawing and quartering is that it was the legally mandated punishment for men convicted of high treason in England from the 13th century until it was eventually abolished in the 19th century, although its application varied over time and was often reserved for the most serious cases. The severed head and the 4 quarters of the body were not simply discarded. They were a crucial part of the punishment's deterrent effect. The head was often displayed prominently, famously on pikes on London Bridge, facing away from the city as a warning to those approaching. The 4 quarters of the body were sent to different parts of the country where the traitor had been active, to be displayed on city gates or other public places. Imagine traveling to London and seeing a row of rotting heads on spikes as you crossed the bridge. Talk about a grim welcome mat. Historians still argue whether the specific order of the drawing and quartering process was always strictly followed as laid out in the legal texts, or if the practical realities of executioners' skills and local customs meant there were variations in the timing of the hanging, disemboweling, and decapitation. Was the goal always to keep the victim alive for the gutting, or was it sometimes a post-mortem act? The gruesome details are debated. A quirky or fringe tidbit about drawing and quartering is that while it was the statutory punishment for men, women convicted of high treason were typically sentenced to be burned at the stake. This was ostensibly to preserve their modesty, but burning was also an excruciatingly painful death, making it debatable which sex faced the more horrific end. Imagine the legal reasoning. We can't have a woman disemboweled in public, that's just improper. Let's just burn her alive instead. Much more ladylike. The purpose of drawing and quartering was multifaceted. It was the ultimate act of state power, a complete destruction of the individual who dared to defy the crown. It was a terrifying deterrent, a public spectacle designed to instill fear and obedience in the populace. By dismembering the body and displaying the parts, it also served a symbolic purpose, preventing a proper burial, which in some beliefs could hinder the soul's journey or resurrection. Your body wasn't just killed, it was annihilated and scattered, leaving nothing whole to bury. It was the state saying, "Not only are we ending your life in the worst way possible, but we're also erasing your physical presence and potentially messing with your afterlife." Compared to the systematic bone breaking or the slow agony of boiling, drawing and quartering combined multiple layers of torment, the public humiliation of the dragging, the near-death experience of the hanging, the unimaginable pain of the disemboweling, the final indignity of the mutilation, and the post-mortem display of the body parts. It was a carefully choreographed ritual of state violence, a chilling testament to the lengths to which authorities would go to punish and deter treason in medieval and early modern England. A truly drawn-out and quartered existence, wouldn't you say? Leaving the gruesome dismemberment of drawing and quartering behind us, we moved to punishments that, while perhaps less immediately fatal than being pulled apart by horses, were designed for a different kind of lasting torment, permanent public shame and physical discomfort. Imagine surviving the ordeal, but being marked for life, your crime literally burned into your skin or your body displayed for ridicule and abuse. We're talking about branding in the public stocks or pillory, common sights in towns and cities across Europe and its colonies for centuries. Imagine finding yourself convicted of a range of crimes, anything from petty theft, vagrancy, or cheating at cards, to more serious offenses like forgery, perjury, or even sedition. Depending on the severity and local custom, your sentence might include a permanent mark, a brand burned into your flesh. This wasn't just about pain. It was about identification, about creating a walking record of your criminal past that everyone could see. You couldn't exactly cover up a brand on your face or hand with a discreet bandage forever. Picture the scene. You're in the town square, the heart of public life. A crowd has gathered, drawn by the morbid spectacle. The executioner, or perhaps a blacksmith, stands ready, holding a metal rod with a symbol or letter on the end. This iron rod is heated in a fire until it glows red-hot. The air fills with the smell of burning wood and anticipating dread. You might be tied to a post or held down, unable to struggle effectively. Then comes the moment of contact. The glowing iron is pressed firmly against your skin. There's an immediate, searing pain, a hiss as the flesh burns, and the sickening smell of scorching meat fills your nostrils. The pain is intense and deep, burning through layers of skin and muscle. You might cry out, you might black out, but the mark is made. It leaves a permanent scar, raised and discolored, a constant, visible reminder of your crime. Imagine trying to shake hands with someone after you've been branded on the back of the hand for theft. "Nice to meet you. Oh, is that a T?" Awkward. A mainstream historical fact about branding is that it was a widespread judicial punishment used across many cultures and periods, particularly in Europe and its colonies from the late Middle Ages into the 19th century, serving as both a deterrent and a permanent identifier of convicted criminals. The location and specific mark of the brand often varied depending on the crime and the jurisdiction. You might be branded on the hand or thumb for theft or forgery, making it hard to hide your past. For more serious offenses, the brand might be on the cheek or forehead, ensuring maximum public visibility. Imagine trying to get a job interview with a big, ugly letter branded on your forehead. Probably wouldn't make the best first impression. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that specific letters were often used to denote the crime, such as T for thief, R for rogue or runaway, M for malefactor, or even B for blasphemer. Sometimes symbols like a fleur-de-lis, a lily, were used in France to mark criminals. Historians still argue whether the primary purpose of branding was physical punishment or social humiliation. While the pain was certainly a factor, the lasting shame and the inability to hide your past were arguably the more significant consequences, effectively marginalizing branded individuals and making reintegration into society incredibly difficult. From the searing pain of branding, we transition to a different kind of public discomfort and humiliation, the stocks, and the pillory. These were common fixtures in town squares, simple wooden devices designed to trap offenders in a fixed, awkward position for public display and ridicule. The stocks typically consisted of heavy wooden boards with holes for securing a person's ankles, and sometimes wrists. You would be forced to sit or lie on the ground, your feet locked in place, unable to move. The pillory was similar but designed to secure the head and hands in holes in an upright board or frame. You would stand, unable to lower your head or use your hands freely. Imagine being stuck like that, unable to scratch an itch, swat a fly, or even adjust your clothes. The punishment wasn't just the physical discomfort of being trapped in a strained position for hours. It was the exposure to the public. You were a captive audience for the townsfolk. The crowd could gather around you, shout insults, mock you, and, notoriously, throw things at you. Rotten fruit, vegetables, mud, stones, or even animal excrement were common projectiles. Imagine the indignity of being pelted with rotten tomatoes while stuck in the pillory, unable to duck or defend yourself. It's like being the target in the world's least fun carnival game. This was a punishment often used for minor offenses, public nuisances, or as a supplementary punishment alongside fines or other penalties. Drunkards, vagrants, petty thieves, cheats, gossips, and those who disturbed the peace might find themselves spending time in the stocks or pillory. The duration could range from a few hours to several days, depending on the offense and the magistrate's decree. The purpose was pure public shaming and deterrence. By making the offender a spectacle of ridicule and discomfort, the authorities hoped to discourage similar behavior in others and reinforce social norms. It was a very direct form of community justice, where the community itself participated in the punishment through their mockery and missile throwing. Historians still argue whether the level of abuse inflicted on individuals in the stocks or pillory was generally contained to harmless, albeit humiliating, projectiles like rotten food, or if it frequently escalated into dangerous assaults with harder objects, sometimes even leading to serious injury or death. While official regulations might have prohibited harmful objects, the reality of an angry mob could be quite different. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that sometimes, the ears of individuals in the pillory were nailed to the wood, and after their time was up, they were forced to tear themselves free, leaving part of their ears behind as a permanent mark. This combined the public display of the pillory with a form of physical mutilation similar to what we saw in Egypt. Both branding and the stock/pillory were forms of punishment that left a lasting impression, either physically on the body or mentally through the intense public humiliation. They were less about the swift, brutal ending of life and more about marking the individual as an outcast and subjecting them to the judgment and scorn of their community. You were left alive, but your life was irrevocably changed, forever marked by the experience, a constant reminder that you had stepped out of line. It makes a bad haircut feel like a minor inconvenience. These punishments highlight a different facet of historical justice, one focused on visible shame, permanent stigma, and the active participation of the community in the act of retribution. They were stark reminders that in many historical periods, your reputation, your physical appearance, and your place in society could be stripped away or permanently altered for all to see. Leaving the stocks and the pillory, and the permanent, painful marks of branding behind, we now travel even further east, to the vast and ancient empire of China, where justice could take a form so prolonged and agonizing, it earned a name that chills the blood, lingqi, often translated as death by 1,000 cuts, or slow slicing. If you thought being broken on a wheel or drawn and quartered was bad, prepare yourself for a punishment designed not for speed or even immediate dismemberment, but for the systematic, agonizing removal of the body, piece by small piece, over an extended period. Imagine finding yourself condemned for a crime considered utterly heinous in the eyes of the Chinese imperial law, such as high treason, patricide, matricide, or other acts of extreme sacrilege or rebellion against the state and family structure. These weren't minor offenses. They were crimes that struck at the very heart of the social and political order. Your fate would be lingqi, a punishment that wasn't just about ending your life, but about utterly destroying your body, your dignity, and potentially, according to some beliefs, your very soul. Picture the scene. You are brought to a public execution ground, perhaps outside the city walls or in a designated area. A crowd gathers, drawn by the morbid spectacle, though perhaps also repelled by its horror. You are secured, often tied to a post or a frame, ensuring you cannot move or resist the executioner's work. This immobilization is crucial, as the punishment relies on precision and control. You are exposed, vulnerable, facing the end of your life in the most drawn-out way imaginable. The executioner approaches, not with a heavy axe or a large knife, but with smaller, sharper blades. The process of lingqi involved the systematic removal of portions of the body. This wasn't random hacking, it was a deliberate, step-by-step process. The executioner would begin by making small cuts, perhaps removing skin from the limbs, then perhaps slices of muscle. The cuts would be shallow at first, designed to prolong life and maximize pain. Imagine feeling the blade slice into your skin, the sting, the warmth of blood, repeated over and over again, in different places. It's like the world's worst acupuncture session, where the needles are razor blades and they're taking bits of you with them. The executioner would continue, gradually moving to more substantial parts of the body, always aiming to avoid immediately fatal blows. Strips of flesh, fingers, toes, perhaps even limbs might be removed over time. The pain would be unimaginable, a constant, escalating torment as your body was slowly, methodically dismantled while you were still alive. Some accounts describe the executioner taking breaks, perhaps to sharpen their blades or simply to prolong the agony, leaving the condemned bleeding and suffering, fully aware of their horrifying fate. A mainstream historical fact about lingqi is that it was a legally sanctioned method of execution in China for certain grave crimes from roughly the Liao dynasty, 10th century CE, until it was officially abolished in 1905. It was considered the most severe form of capital punishment. The number of cuts in death by 1,000 cuts is symbolic rather than literal. While the process involved numerous cuts, it wasn't precisely 1,000, or even necessarily hundreds. The number varied depending on the executioner, the specific crime, and the period. The term simply emphasizes the prolonged, multi-stage nature of the punishment. It's like saying you have a million things to do. You probably don't, but the sentiment is clear. Historians still argue about the exact details of how lingqi was carried out in practice across different periods and regions of China. While some historical accounts and later photographs from the early 20th century depict a very systematic, almost ritualistic process of dismemberment, the extent to which this was standardized throughout the many centuries of its use is debated. Was it always a slow, drawn-out torture, or did it sometimes involve quicker, more decisive cuts, depending on the executioner's skill or intent? A quirky or fringe tidbit related to lingqi is the belief, sometimes associated with the punishment, that by dismembering the body, it prevented the condemned from having a complete body in the afterlife, thereby condemning their soul to eternal wandering or preventing reincarnation. This added a spiritual layer of horror to the physical torment, aiming to destroy the individual not just in this life, but beyond. Imagine being worried about your celestial body parts after enduring that. Oh great, now I have to find my pinky toe in the spirit realm. The purpose of lingqi was multifaceted and deeply rooted in Chinese legal and philosophical thought. It was the ultimate form of retribution, a penalty designed to match the perceived enormity of the crime, particularly those that violated the sacred bonds of family, filial impiety, or the absolute authority of the emperor, treason. It was also a terrifying deterrent, a spectacle so horrific that it would theoretically prevent anyone from even contemplating such offenses. Furthermore, as mentioned with the quirky tidbit, it was believed to have consequences beyond death, ensuring the complete annihilation of the individual. The public nature of the execution was, as with many historical punishments, crucial. It wasn't hidden away. The condemned's suffering was a public performance of state power and the consequences of extreme transgression. The sight of a body being slowly sliced apart would have been a deeply traumatic and unforgettable experience for onlookers, a visceral reminder of the state's absolute power and its capacity for extreme cruelty. Compared to the relatively swift impact of falling from the Tarpeian Rock or the contained terror of the Roman sack, lingqi was a punishment of sustained, deliberate agony. It required a level of control and precision from the executioner, focused on prolonging suffering rather than achieving a quick death. It highlights a different cultural approach to capital punishment, one that prioritized the symbolic and physical disintegration of the condemned over time. It makes getting a paper cut feel like winning the lottery. While the practice was officially abolished in the early 20th century, the chilling accounts and surviving photographs serve as a stark reminder of the extremes to which judicial punishment could go. Lynching stands as one of history's most infamous and horrifying methods of execution, a chilling testament to the capacity for human cruelty when applied to the task of dispensing justice, or perhaps, just enacting ultimate vengeance. A truly cutting critique of ancient justice, wouldn't you say? Leaving the realm of painful permanence and slow slicing behind, we journey across oceans and continents to the heart of Mesoamerica, to the powerful and complex civilization of the Aztecs. Known for their stunning architecture, intricate calendar, and demanding gods, the Aztecs also had a legal system that was incredibly strict, where breaking the law wasn't just a secular offense but often a transgression against the cosmic order itself. And let me tell you, the consequences for upsetting that order could be swift, severe, and deeply tied to their unique worldview. Imagine yourself living in the bustling Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan in the 15th century. Life is governed by strict social hierarchies and demanding religious practices. While many aspects of Aztec society were sophisticated, their approach to crime and punishment was often starkly unforgiving. Forget second chances or subtle penalties. Many offenses, even those we might consider minor today, could lead to death. And not always a quick one. The severity of the punishment often depended on several factors: the nature of the crime, the social status of the offender, and sometimes the victim, and whether it was a first-time offense. Priests and nobility were often held to even higher standards than commoners, facing harsher penalties for similar crimes, a fascinating contrast to systems like Hammurabi's where status could lessen the punishment. It seems if you were closer to the gods or the emperor, your fall was expected to be harder. Let's consider some examples. Drunkenness, while tolerated in certain contexts like religious festivals, was a serious offense for most commoners, especially if it led to other crimes or public disorder. A first offense might result in public humiliation and having your head shaved, a major indignity in Aztec society. But repeat offenses? You could face severe beatings, or even execution. Imagine losing your life just for one too many margaritas. Talk about a killer hangover. Theft was another crime met with harsh penalties. Depending on the value of the stolen goods and whether the thief was caught in the act, punishments ranged from becoming a slave to the victim to public execution. If you were caught stealing certain items, particularly from temples or markets, your fate could be sealed quickly. One method of execution was stoning. Imagine being tied to a post or placed in a pit, and having people from the community throw stones at you until you died. It wasn't necessarily quick, and it was a highly public, community-involved death. It makes getting hit by a rogue golf ball seem like a gentle tap. Another severe punishment, often reserved for serious crimes like adultery or certain types of murder, was strangulation. This could be done publicly, sometimes by garroting, using a cord or metal wire tightened around the neck. Again, not a pleasant way to go, and designed for public viewing. But some punishments were tied more directly to the religious and ritualistic aspects of Aztec life. Consider the consequences for certain types of sacrilege or offenses against the gods. These could involve being sacrificed to the very deities you offended. While human sacrifice was a complex part of Aztec religion, its use as a punishment for specific crimes added another layer of terror. Imagine being marched up the steps of a temple, knowing that your death wasn't just a legal penalty, but a forced offering to the gods, perhaps having your heart removed while you were still alive. Definitely not the kind of community service you want to sign up for. A mainstream historical fact about Aztec law is that it was remarkably comprehensive and strictly enforced, with severe penalties, including capital punishment, applied even for offenses like theft, adultery, and public drunkenness, particularly for commoners. This strictness was seen as essential for maintaining social order and appeasing the gods. The concept of shame was also a powerful tool in the Aztec legal system. Public humiliation, marking the offender, or forcing them to confess publicly were often integrated into punishments, serving as a deterrent and reinforcing social norms. Losing face, or even having your head shaved, could be a devastating social blow, often a prelude to even harsher consequences. A quirky or fringe tidbit relates to the punishment for certain market offenses, such as cheating or selling poor-quality goods. Offenders could be publicly beaten in the marketplace and have their goods destroyed. But in some accounts, for severe or repeat offenses, they could be summarily executed right there in the market by an angry mob or market officials. Imagine running a little fruit stand and getting executed on the spot because someone complained your avocados weren't ripe enough. Talk about tough customer service. Historians still argue whether the severity of Aztec punishments, particularly the frequency of capital punishment for seemingly minor crimes and the scale of human sacrifice, was accurately represented by the Spanish conquistadors and chroniclers, or if these accounts were exaggerated to justify the Spanish conquest and portray the Aztecs as barbaric. While archaeological evidence confirms human sacrifice was practiced, the extent to which it was used as a punishment versus a religious ritual involving captives or volunteers is a subject of ongoing debate. The purpose behind these harsh penalties was deeply ingrained in the Aztec worldview. They believed that maintaining social order and appeasing the gods were essential for the survival of their empire and the cosmos itself. Crime disrupted this order, and severe punishment, even death, was seen as necessary to restore balance and prevent divine wrath. Public executions and rituals served as terrifying reminders of the consequences of transgression and the absolute power of the state and the priesthood. It wasn't just about punishing the individual. It was about sending a message to the gods and the entire population. While the Aztecs didn't have the elaborate machinery of the breaking wheel or the specific animal companions of the Roman sack, their punishments were equally terrifying in their severity, their public nature, and their deep connection to religious belief. Being stoned, strangled, or potentially even sacrificed, all for transgressions that might seem relatively minor today, highlights a justice system driven by a profound sense of cosmic responsibility and a willingness to enforce order through extreme fear. It makes community service sound like a spa day. These Aztec punishments offer a glimpse into a culture where law, religion, and social control were intricately linked, and where the price of stepping out of line could be incredibly high, ending not just your life, but potentially impacting your fate in the afterlife through ritual dismemberment or sacrifice. A truly demanding legal system, wouldn't you agree? Leaving the demanding legal system of the Aztecs, where justice was often tied to cosmic balance and swift, severe ends, we finally arrive back in our own time, or at least closer to it, to reflect on the long, dark shadow cast by these bizarre and brutal punishments. We've journeyed through sacks filled with animals, faced hungry beasts in the arena, endured the slow agony of the cross, felt the sickening plunge from a cliff, witnessed the permanent marks of mutilation and branding, cringed at the systematic breaking of bones, the dismemberment of traitors, the slow slicing of the condemned, and the harsh, often fatal, retribution of ancient codes and rituals. It's been a journey through a landscape of pain, fear, and public spectacle, a stark contrast to the principles that underpin most modern justice systems. Think about the core purposes of the punishments we've explored tonight. They were almost universally public, designed not just to punish the individual, but to terrify the onlookers. They were often physically destructive, leaving permanent marks on the body, either through mutilation, branding, or the very manner of death, sometimes believed to impact the afterlife. They were frequently tied to specific, often symbolic, violations: the hand that stole, the tongue that slandered, the body that betrayed the family or state. And they were rooted in ideas of retribution, deterrence, and the absolute power of the state or ruling authority. You weren't just being corrected, you were being made an example of, in the most visceral way possible. Compare that to the goals of modern justice in many parts of the world: rehabilitation, proportional punishment, restorative justice. And while deterrence is still a factor, it's usually not achieved through public torture or dismemberment. Executions, where they still occur, are typically carried out privately, away from public view. Imprisonment, while a deprivation of liberty, is, ideally, not meant to involve systematic physical mutilation or being eaten alive by insects. We recoil at the thought of the stocks, not just for the discomfort, but for the public humiliation. We reject branding because it permanently labels and marginalizes an individual. It's like we collectively decided that making someone a walking billboard for their mistakes wasn't the most effective or humane approach. A mainstream historical fact about the evolution of justice is that the Enlightenment period in Europe, starting in the 18th century, saw significant philosophical challenges to the use of torture and excessively cruel punishments. Thinkers like Cesare Beccaria argued against the death penalty and advocated for punishments that were proportional to the crime, certain, and swift, rather than overly severe or prolonged, influencing legal reforms across the continent and beyond. This marked a major shift away from the spectacle and brutality of earlier eras towards a focus on rational, codified law and more humane treatment, even of criminals. The rejection of these bizarre and brutal methods wasn't just a sudden change of heart. It was a slow, uneven process, often driven by changing social values, philosophical movements, and increasing concerns about human rights, even for those who committed terrible acts. The public spectacle aspect, while powerful for control, also sometimes backfired, generating sympathy for the condemned or even leading to riots. As societies became more complex and ideas about the individual's place within society evolved, the utility and morality of punishments like boiling alive or drawing and quartering were increasingly questioned. Historians still argue whether the abolition of these brutal punishments was primarily due to humanitarian concerns, or if it was more about the changing needs of the state. Perhaps public executions became less necessary for social control as other forms of authority and surveillance developed. Or maybe they were simply seen as inefficient and messy in an increasingly bureaucratic world. Was it genuine progress towards compassion, or just a different form of social engineering? The debate continues, but the practical outcome was a significant shift away from the types of horrors we've discussed tonight. Think about the psychological impact of these historical methods. The constant threat of arbitrary cruelty, the knowledge that a minor transgression could lead to permanent disfigurement, or a terrifying death, the sheer terror of public exposure and humiliation. It wasn't just about the pain, it was about breaking the spirit, erasing dignity, and instilling a deep-seated fear of authority. Remember being sewn into that sack with animals? Or feeling the wind rush past as you fell from the Tarpeian rock? Or the slow, inevitable agony of the cross? These weren't just ways to end a life. They were ways to maximize suffering and send an unforgettable message. It makes getting a strongly worded email from your boss seem like a warm hug, doesn't it? While we've moved away from the physical mutilation and public torture, some echoes of these ancient practices can still be seen, albeit in vastly different forms. The idea of public shaming, though not involving stocks or pillories, can manifest in modern media coverage of crimes or online call-out culture. The concept of permanent marking, while not literal branding with hot irons, can be seen in criminal records that follow individuals for life, impacting their ability to find housing or employment. And deterrence is still a cornerstone of legal theory, even if the methods employed are, thankfully, less creative in their cruelty. We still want people to think twice before breaking the law. We just hope they do it because they understand the consequences, not because they're worried about being eaten by flies in a boat. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that even after the official abolition of some of the most brutal punishments, there were often lingering practices or attempts at more humane alternatives that still seem strange today. For instance, in the 19th century, some places experimenting with execution methods considered things like a humane garrote or even early, clumsy attempts at electrocution, which often went horribly wrong, highlighting the difficult and often unsettling transition away from older methods. It seems finding a nice way to end someone's life legally was, and still is, a complex problem. Ultimately, looking back at these bizarre punishments from ancient Rome and beyond offers a sobering perspective. It reminds us that justice systems are not static. They evolve, reflecting the values, fears, and technological capabilities of the societies that create them. It highlights humanity's capacity for both incredible cruelty and eventual, albeit slow and imperfect, progress towards more humane treatment of even those deemed criminals. It makes you appreciate the relative safety and anonymity of modern life, where being caught cheating on your taxes doesn't usually involve losing a hand or being thrown to the lions. As we let these images from history fade, the dusty arena, the stone cliff, the crowded square, the silent river, we can perhaps find a strange kind of comfort in the distance of time and the evolution of justice. The terror and spectacle of ancient punishments are largely confined to the history books, replaced by systems that, while imperfect, strive for different goals and employ vastly different methods. It's a reminder of how far we've come, and perhaps, how vigilant we must remain to ensure that justice serves not just the need for order and retribution, but also the fundamental dignity of the human being, even when they have wronged. The echoes of ancient pain are still there, a whisper from the past reminding us of the price paid for order, and the long, slow journey towards something better. The journey through history's most bizarre punishments is now complete. You've faced down lions, stared up from the foot of the Tarpeian Rock, felt the sting of the brand, and perhaps even imagined the slow decay in the boats. It's been a heavy trip, filled with discomfort and chilling details, a far cry from the gentle comforts of the present moment. But now, as the echoes of ancient screams and the metallic tang of historical blood fade, you can feel yourself drifting back, away from the dusty squares and grim execution sites, back to the safety of your own space. The air is calm here, the sounds are familiar and soft. There are no roaring crowds, no glinting blades, no hungry insects in sight. Just the quiet hum of the fan, the gentle darkness, and the feeling of being safe and sound. Let the images soften, the tension ease away from your shoulders. You are here now, untouched by the horrors of the past. Just relax, breathe slowly, and let yourself sink deeper into the quiet. There's nothing to fear here. The night is calm. And soon you'll be fast asleep.